Okay, ladies and gentlemen, hello everyone, and welcome to this evening's RSC Belgium talk. This evening we welcome to Belgium Dr. Victoria Atkinson. Victoria is a third-generation chemist, she tells us. She studied chemistry at Oxford, including a fourth-year master's project working on catalytic methodology with Darren Dixon, and that led to her first publication. She then continued to do a PhD with Jerry Robertson on a total synthesis project employing enzymatic methodology to produce agrochemical products. However, towards the end of her PhD, Victoria found that she was enjoying talking about science a little more than actually doing too much of it, something I think we all probably agree with, and became heavily involved in science outreach, showing her enthusiasm for science with younger students through practical workshops and school visits. Later she focused on developing new outreach material and then made the transition to freelance science journalism by a prestigious Marriott internship with RSC's own Chemistry World magazine. Today she works on a range of publications specialising in chemistry, sustainability and research culture. Tonight she's going to talk to us about some of the work that was involved with a recent article in Chemistry World, which is exploring the maybe forgotten chemistry behind folk cures and witchcraft. Victoria, please. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm really pleased that so many people enjoyed the article in Chemistry World. So this was based on a feature which was released earlier this month, looking at the chemistry that underpins witchcraft. So I think there's kind of a universal fascination into some of these precursors to modern science. These practices that gradually evolved into what we recognise as chemistry today. So of course alchemy is widely celebrated as chemistry's forerunner, and of course there were lots of innovations and discoveries that arose from that, the discovery of phosphorus being just one. But the sort of plant-based and more herbal practice of witchcraft that was going on at exactly the same time, so we're talking around 1500 in Europe, it just doesn't receive the same credit. It was largely dismissed as nonsense and hocus pocus. And there could be strong social reasons for this. Obviously alchemy was performed by generally rich gentlemen of high status. Danish alchemist Tycho Brahe famously built his own alchemical palace on an isolated island, whereas witches were typically women at the lower end of the social spectrum, so they just didn't have those same resources to be taken seriously. So I really wanted to kind of dig into, the actual science behind this. Nobody has ever transformed lead into gold using the Philosopher's Stone, but people have achieved marvellous things using plants and mixtures of those plants. So I wanted to see whether there is more to witchcraft than hocus pocus and whether there's really some science behind those spells. But before we get any further, it's really important that we define what we actually mean by witchcraft in this context. Magic has fascinated people for as long as civilizations have been going. What we don't understand or what we couldn't explain, we attributed to magic, from the sun rising and setting to phenomena such as the Northern Lights. And this means that every culture has its own ideas. The mythology of magic and witchcraft has evolved independently time and time again through time and across the world. So we can see here some of the different manifestations of this folklore. There are different aims, there are different people practicing that art, and they are also perceived differently within their societies. So in the case of Chinese shamanism, that has a very spiritual focus, so the shaman acts as an intermediary between the spirits and the people. Voodoo tends to focus more on possession of those spirits, whereas practices such as West African juju tend to focus more on the sort of ritualistic object luck factors. Ancient Mexican witchcraft, Mayan magic, probably has more in common with what we recognise as Western witchcraft. They would use psychoactive substances from plants to elevate the practitioners to the level of the gods. But what I'm going to be focusing on for the remainder of this talk is Western European witchcraft. So we're referring specifically to the period roughly 15th century to 18th century. And I think that this is very much the stereotypical image that comes to mind for most people when we talk about a witch. So a wizened old woman hunched over a bubbling cauldron, using mixtures of plants that she's obtained from an overgrown garden outside of her rural cottage, and using this to cast spells and create potions, which then have either malevolent or miraculous effects depending on your perspective. But if we strip back all of these narrative flourishes, what we're left with is a woman who is combining different plants to create a mixture which has a physical effect on a human. And really, there's nothing so fantastical about that if we think about it through the lens of modern chemistry. We know that plants produce many secondary metabolites, generally as part of their own defense mechanism, and that these compounds can have profound and often very varied effects within the human body. And indeed, this is the basis of many of our modern drugs. Some, such as morphine and quinine, we use exactly as they are derived from the plant. Others, such as Taxol, we can either obtain from the plant or prepare via semi-synthesis, so using an earlier plant metabolite and then performing our own synthetic reactions to generate the desired drug compound. And there are others, such as aspirin, which are simply inspired from products which have been created by plants. So I think if we consider this sort of chemical basis for the fact that plants can have physiological effects, we can begin to sift through all of the superstition and slander and really uncover that science that has been mislabeled as magic for all of this time. But before we get any further, it's important as well that we have a slight disclaimer here, because we're going to be working with historical records and accounts from a time when record keeping was not quite so rigorous as it is today. Many of the documents and the accounts and the references that are used to compile this sort of information are very partial, they're quite spotty, and they're often incredibly prejudiced. The women typically involved in this sort of practice, and I say women, predominantly women, but not exclusively, these people would largely, if not exclusively, be illiterate, and therefore they would share and pass down their knowledge orally, writing very little down, perhaps just providing a few drawings. And this means that any written accounts that we have of what was going on are likely written by gentlemen, clergymen, physicians, apothecaries, politicians, the very people seeking to discredit and dismiss these women. And this means that we have to take all of these accounts with a bit of a pinch of salt. We can only speculate on what was going on, but using chemical reasoning, I think it's possible to infer a kind of rational explanation for some of the stories which surround witchcraft. Beginning, of course, with the most iconic image, that of a witch on a broom. So this idea and this image has really been present for the entire period that we're interested in. So you can see here on the left, we actually have the earliest ever depiction of a witch on a broom, and this dates all the way back to 1451. But where has this idea come from? It's such a random thing to just create out of nowhere. Well, various historical accounts make reference to flying ointment. So this is a mixture of herbs, baby fat, bone ash, and possibly a few other ingredients, which would be applied to a broom handle or a stick and then wiped on the legs. And somehow this would enable the user to fly. Now, there's nothing in that which actually suggests that anyone was flying anywhere. I think we can all safely agree that this isn't literal flying. But if we look a bit deeper into the identity of these herbs, then it can provide us with a few answers. So the herbs in question, which appear throughout these accounts, the specifics can vary depending on the region. The main plants that we encounter here are deadly nightshade, mandrake, henbane, and aconite. And these are all members of the nightshade family. Now, crucially, all of these plants produce highly hallucinogenic alkaloids. So, scopolamine at the bottom, atropine, and hyoscyamine are all tropane alkaloids. Aconitine is a more complex polycyclic alkaloid. And these specifically act as anticholinergics, which mean that they block the binding of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine to muscarinic receptors within the nervous system. And this effectively destabilizes the whole nervous system to create a sense of delirium and trigger hallucinations. And in fact, these hallucinations are so intense that it becomes difficult for the user to actually distinguish between reality and vision at all, meaning they awaken from their trip believing that everything they've experienced actually happened. And further to this, the nature of that hallucination, the subject of their trip, is heavily determined by the manner in which they consumed the alkaloid in question. And a part of this is physical suggestion. So the circumstances under which they took it provided almost a seed of inspiration for their brain to take the hallucination somewhere. So in the case of flying ointment, you've applied this hallucinogenic mixture to a broom and rubbed it between your legs. You then got high, metaphorically, so you imagine that you've got high, literally. So I think you can see the connection between the situation in which the alkaloid was taken and the resulting hallucination. And this is consistent with the fact that application to genitals results in erotic dreams. The case of consumption with food or drink is a little more obscure. It's slightly more difficult to see the connection. Consumption in this way tends to result in reports that the person has been transformed into an animal, they've been transfigured in some way. But again, there is an element of suggestion here which derives from one of the other side effects of alkaloid poisoning. Specifically, when these compounds are ingested by mouth, they result in an effect called paresthesia. And this is a sensation of tingling or prickling on the skin, which many users have described as feeling like sprouting fur or feathers. So again, we've got that connection to feeling like an animal. And we can indeed see this within the myth of Circe. So here we have an extract from Homer's Odyssey. And this is, here we have Ulysses returning from war, and on the journey, him and his men stop at an island which belongs to the sorceress Circe. Circe greets the men with wine and a feast, but it turns out that this wine was poisoned and the men are transformed into pigs. Now, of course, this is a fictional story belonging to Greek myth, and we don't tend to think that there's any reason to believe that Circe was a real person. But using other details in the story and knowledge of what plants were available in that region at the time, ethnopharmacologists have suggested that the unnamed poison within this story is in fact another plant called jimsonweed. And it turns out this is another member of the nightshade family. So again, it contains those hallucinogenic alkaloids, atropine and scopolamine. And this hypothesis is rather borne out by subsequent events in the story. Instructed by Hermes, Ulysses is told to find an antidote to the poison that Circe has given his men. Hermes instructs Ulysses to find a plant with white flowers and black bulbs, which is called moly. And this has been identified as the snowdrop, which contains another alkaloid called galantamine. Now, galantamine is an acetylcholine esterase, which means that it unblocks those blocked receptors in the nervous system, thereby ending the hallucination and acting as an antidote to alkaloid poisoning. And consequently, when the men take this antidote, they are untransformed from being pigs. But if we return back to the flying ointment, I think we've established that it's likely that this idea of flight came from a hallucination created by these hallucinogenic plants. But actually, these non-psychoactive ingredients listed here, the baby fat and the bone ash, are also just as important to achieving this effect. Simply knowing that the plant contains these hallucinogenic compounds is not enough to actually create those hallucinations. These compounds must first be converted into a form that, one, we can extract them from the plant, and two, they can be used by the body. Now, of course, witches wouldn't have any awareness of this. They wouldn't know that there were any compounds that they had to change at all. But they certainly had a sense that some process was required in order to activate or prepare the plant such that it would produce the effect that they were looking for. So if we focus in on deadly nightshade, the highest concentration of atropine is within the roots of the plant, and it's stored here in the form of a salt. So two different charged ions which enable it to be soluble in the watery environment of the cell interior, but protect it from actually diffusing out through the lipid membrane barrier. But in order to get out of the plant cell and into our own cells, and crucially across the blood-brain barrier to the brain to produce that hallucination, it needs converting into the neutral free base form. And this is where the bone ash comes in. As an alkaline material, the bone ash converts the salt form into the free base form, enabling this atropine to become available. This material is then dissolved in baby fat, which effectively takes the role of a solvent here. It provides it into a form which is easy to then apply to, say, your broomstick handle, and makes it readily absorb through the greasy surface of the skin. Now, of course, it's unlikely that witches were actually using either bone ash or baby fat, because really, if you were going around murdering babies and burning their bones, I think you would probably be tried for murder a long time before you were tried for witchcraft. So it's likely that this is all part of the negative and scandalous language that surrounded witchcraft and was used to discredit these people and to build distrust and fear in their communities. Essentially, any alkaline material would have worked, so ordinary ash from a fire would have been just fine. Likewise, any old animal fat, vegetable fat, would work equally well. But there's a whole world of secret language that surrounds witchcraft, going beyond just this type of slanderous language. Often, the recipes that witches used were very secretive. They were working in competition with each other. They didn't want other people to know what they were doing, steal their ideas, or use them against them. And this meant that they created unusual names for many of the ingredients that they commonly used. So we can see an example of that in this extract from Shakespeare. So here we have a passage from Macbeth. This is the famous witches' chant from the three weird sisters on the top of the heath, creating their famous potion. And if you read through, there are all sorts of obscure, bizarre, and rather arcane sounding ingredients in this. Eye of newt, toe of frog, wool of bat, tongue of dog. I mean, there's certainly a rhythmic, ritualistic quality to the passage, but the names of these ingredients are really calculated to create a sense of mysticism and a kind of sinister atmosphere. But in fact, these outlandish ingredients are just names for plants. And many of them have been associated with fairly bog standard plants available in the UK. So obviously, Shakespeare's witches were intended as sinister characters, and this is likely quite typical of the way that witches were portrayed in media at this sort of time, creating this idea of something evil, something sinister. So far this means that we've got quite a biased impression of what these women are doing. Everything is slanted towards making you distrust and fear. But this is likely very far from the reality of the day-to-day of these women. Probably they were just ordinary members of rural societies, likely taking the role of the village healer, providing services such as a doctor would, maybe physiotherapy, midwifery, all of these kind of standard practices that would come under the general bracket of healthcare today. And then, the nature in which they did this would vary from what we would consider practical through to slightly more mystic. So they would provide herbal remedies, poultices, ointments, salves, all fairly reasonable things that we would imagine to be effective, coupled as well with things such as potions, charms, spells and talismans. But bear in mind, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, magic and medicine were very closely linked. Mysticism and ritual were frequently used alongside more genuine practical treatments, and it wasn't uncommon for a genuine physician, a gentleman physician, to prescribe prayer in addition to any concoction of his own. But we can see this combination of mysticism and practicality in this extract from a spell. So this is taken from a witch trial document. So Ursula Kemp was a woman in Essex in 1852. She had provided her neighbour with a recipe to assist with her lameness. But subsequently, she and the neighbour fell out. There was an accusation of witchcraft, and Ursula Kemp was tried and unfortunately found guilty of witchcraft. And this recipe was then used as evidence against her. But if we read through the details, then we can see this combination of what we would consider theological alongside a more rational treatment solution. So knead together hog's dung and chervil, hold it in the left hand, prick it with a knife 3 times and throw it into the fire. Then take the knife, make 3 pricks under a table and let the knife stick there. After that, take 3 leaves of sage and as much of herb john, put them in ale and drink it last at night and first in the morning. So I think it's safe to say that probably throwing some dung in the fire and sticking a knife in a table is not going to do a fat lot for your lameness. But actually, could this herbal mixture have actually done anything to relieve symptoms of lameness? Well, today we know that sage contains phenolics, so these have antispasmodic and anti-inflammatory properties, whereas St. John's wort contains hyperforin and a collection of compounds called flavonoids, which also possess anti-inflammatory properties. Combined then with this alcoholic solvent, this may have had some sort of useful effect if your lameness was caused by spasm or inflammation, for example, a muscle strain. I mean, the alternative as well is that this could just be a placebo. Somebody has gone to see somebody, that person has listened, provided them with a potential solution, and the patient has left feeling like they've been heard and they've now got something that they can do to make their situation better. There's no way of telling what the actual efficacy of this was, but I think regardless of whether this worked or not, it's clear that there was some awareness that plants can have a connection to health, that they can have some sort of medicinal benefits. And of course, they would have had a lot of plants to work with. Here we just have a small subset of the sorts of plants that would have been available. So I've listed the uses that they would have known at the time, rather than how we would use them today, and then identified the compounds that we know are in those plants which might have been responsible for the effects that they observed. And I think what we can draw from this straight away is that there was clearly a huge amount of knowledge involved in this practice. These women would have to be able to identify a vast number of plants, all the while retaining that knowledge of what sort of conditions this would treat. And I think that also suggests an understanding of the human body and how different systems and different conditions are connected. The importance of this knowledge is evidenced in the fact that many of these are still used today in alternative medicine. Many people choose to use these treatments as an alternative to or a companion to conventional medicine. The majority actually often in the same way as they were used back then. An exception to this is aloe vera, which contains anthraquinones. So they would have used this as a laxative. Today we know that that's not safe for human consumption, so we no longer use it like that. But it is still used for conditions such as skin irritation and sunburn. But some others that you might be familiar with. Arnica oil is often available in pharmacies to aid with bruising. People sometimes drink nettle tea to soothe inflammation or help with joint pain. and valerian is a common aid for sleeping. But of course, another component of this is knowing the dose, because you don't want to dose up on so much valerian that you stay asleep forever. So of course, this is particularly important where it's a high-risk treatment, where you're doing something that could potentially put the patient at risk. So an example of one of these more risky procedures would of course be abortion. Regardless of religious attitudes, of the opinions of the church, termination of pregnancy is something that women throughout history have always needed and have always found ways to advise each other upon. And at this time that we're talking about, within Britain certainly, the plant of choice would have been savin. So this is a member of the juniper family. It's likely that this would have been prepared into an essential oil, so probably boiling it up in a cauldron, possibly even achieving some sort of procedure a little bit similar to steam distillation today. And the major component of that savin oil would be this compound at the bottom here, savinyl acetate. So modern mouse studies have evidenced that this compound is teratogenic, embryotoxic, and inhibits implantation of the embryo. So strong evidence that this would definitely work as an abortive agent. However, it's also incredibly maternally hepatotoxic, so it can cause really significant liver damage. This is one of many reasons why this is not a treatment that we use today. But crucially, this means that there was a very delicate balance that needed to be trod when witches or herbal healers were providing this service to women. They needed to be able to effectively terminate the pregnancy without causing harm to the mother. And this idea of preparation leads to the third component of real chemical knowledge shown by these sorts of practices. Many compounds exist in the plants as prodrugs, so as an inactive form which needs converting into a different form in order to achieve those pharmaceutical effects. An example of this is salicin, which is the active component of willow bark, which is used for pain relief. So today, we've actually derived the drug aspirin from this. Salicin is known to irritate the stomach, which is why that's no longer used. But this compound here is a glycoside, so it's the active component attached to a sugar. And in order to actually function and achieve that pain relieving effect, the sugar part needs cleaving off via a hydrolysis reaction. So once consumed, this occurs within the body. The sugar is hydrolyzed off to form salicylyl alcohol, which then undergoes various other reactions to achieve that pain relieving effect. Now in the case of salicin, this occurs within the body itself, but for many other compounds, it's necessary to effect this type of change before consuming the compound. And we can achieve similar or additional transformations through processes such as steeping, fermentation, or drying. So drying a plant extract can, by removing the moisture, you slow the enzymatic reactions occurring there, or halt them entirely. Whereas heating can degrade those chemical components within the plant, and that changes the overall chemical profile of your material. So if we consider the example of tea, there is only one species of tea plant, and all varieties of tea are derived from that. The different drying procedures tailor the amount of oxidation that goes on in those leaves, and that in turn modulates the final flavour and aroma of the blend. So despite not having any particular chemical or scientific understanding of what was going on in all of these different plants, there was a huge amount of awareness about how they needed to be prepared in order to achieve the desired effect. And it's likely that this extensive knowledge was just one of many factors which contributed to the suspicion, the fear, and the accusations of witch hunting which swept Europe during this period. It's estimated that more than 50,000 people lost their lives, more than 75% of which were women. And of course, part of the reason for this is that it was believed that women had no stake in science. They had no qualification, no understanding of it. Anything that they did know, they must have obtained by occult means. They must have colluded with the devil. It couldn't possibly be genuine knowledge, genuine science. So this was part of why physicians and apothecaries were eager to discredit this. They treated this female knowledge with derision and distrust. Meanwhile, clergy were outraged by the idea of this collusion with the devil, and also strongly disapproved of certain of these services provided by such women, for example, family control. Another important aspect of context when considering this is that the period we're discussing coincides with a time of extreme religious turbulence in Europe. During the Reformation, trust really broke down within communities and between communities. People flung accusations of heresy backwards and forth, the punishment for which was being burnt at the stake like a witch. And it was easy to ascribe what you didn't understand or didn't agree with to collusion with the devil, to witchcraft, to something evil. But of course, after a period of time, greater religious tolerance began to emerge. As the community settled, accusations of witchcraft began to peter out. And in addition, the emergence of science and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution meant that belief in magic began to fade. And in fact, in 1735, the UK passed the Witchcraft Act, making it illegal for anyone to accuse anyone else of achieving anything via means of witchcraft. It became illegal to accuse somebody of being a witch rather than being a witch. This marks a bizarre turning point in history. So as a result of this, these practices fell out of use, and the oral traditions, which had been passed from mother to daughter for generations and generations, were slowly forgotten. So given the way that this information has been recorded, the slanderous way that it was recorded by the people that could produce accounts, and the missing knowledge that was lost by those that could only pass their information on orally, does any legacy remain of witchcraft? Well, there are a few tiny sparkles of knowledge which perhaps owe their origin to this. So the heart medication digitalis was originally extracted from the foxglove. This is another cardiac glycoside which is used to treat heart failure, and the credit for its discovery goes to William Withering. But we can see from his own account here that actually he got this recipe from a local wise woman. In the year 1775, my opinion was asked concerning a family receipt for the cure of dropsy, heart failure. I was told that it had long been kept a secret by an old woman in Shropshire who had sometimes made cures after the more regular practitioners had failed. So over the next 10 years or so, Withering evaluated foxglove preparations, different concentrations, different doses, different forms of administering the plant, until he finally identified the ideal mixture in order to treat dropsy. And the active compound itself wasn't isolated until the beginning of the 20th century. Today though, digitalis, which is a combination of these molecules at the bottom, is an essential medicine on the World Health Organization's essential medicine list. And this is a rare example of women actually getting the credit for their knowledge. But with so few of these examples, it's difficult to trace their precise contributions to modern chemistry and really how far witchcraft led to our current understanding. But I think what is clear from all of this is that there's much more to these claims of magic than just hocus pocus. Thank you for listening.
Victoria, lots of interesting things. Now, what's dropsy? Do I know what dropsy is?
Heart failure.
Heart failure. Of course it is. Heart failure. You drop. Of course you do. Makes sense. Yeah, I remember. Also the willow salicylic acid. I remember a story about why beavers sort of disappeared from Europe because they concentrated the active ingredient within their sort of tail area, and so beavers were taken for fur, meat, which you could also eat on a Friday because it was deemed a fish, and also for medical reasons, which was interesting. But anyway, fascinating. Any questions that you've...
A very simple observation. Paracelsus, whom you remember no doubt, from about this period of the 1500s, he came up with the famous dictum, the dose is the poison. And in fact, you could see this very clearly. We have a very good example here, but just in a chapter I was writing in my book yesterday, we actually have frequent use of anticoagulant drugs like warfarin, which are toxic to rats.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's a good example of the dose makes the poison. The equivalent dose that a 70 kilogram man takes is innocuous, but it could damn well be toxic to a 200 gram rat. And that, I think, is one of the explanations of a lot of this stuff. It's dependent on the dose. If you get the dose right, it can cure. If you get the dose wrong, it can kill.
I mean, I think
because anything can be toxic. Anything, even sodium chloride in water.
Water's toxic.
I mean, I think what we don't see behind some of this is all of the trial and error, which actually led to these conclusions that they made. I mean, they passed this knowledge on orally, but how many failed experiments were there behind
Lots
that?
and lots.
I mean, we don't know, and that sort of thing wasn't recorded. So yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, I can imagine that particularly whilst they were working out how to terminate a pregnancy, that there might have been a few mishaps there.
Biodiversity is a popular word today, but it's probably very important, and as far as I know, the scientists still find plants that can give useful molecules, etc., that can be used for medicine or other useful applications. Do you know a little bit how much of the...
So I know that they tend to focus on species such as sea sponges. So specifically organisms which don't have another mechanism of defense, which is why plants tend to produce more of these metabolites than animals, because animals can run away or bite you, whereas plants don't really have that option. But I think probably just because of the exposure that we've had to terrestrial plants, then plants under the sea, sea sponges, and other plants deep within the rainforest, those that we've not had access to for quite the same length of time, are perhaps where they focus their attention, just because they've got less anecdotal knowledge of what those species might be capable of.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your talk. I'm interested in the idea of the trial and error that kind of went behind it, and I was wondering if you had any information that could expand on, for example, were there strategies that were passed on how to avoid using human subjects or animal subjects, for that matter, in order to figure out if there was, like if you found a plant, a random plant in the woods or whatever, like, and you brought it home and you just wanted to test, were there strategies passed down?
So I'm afraid I don't actually have any idea on that point. I imagine that ethics were far less of a consideration at the time, so they wouldn't have had the same qualms, I guess, about just testing it out. And presumably as well, people who are desperate will go for anything. But I suspect if they were thinking of doing an experiment just off the cuff, that perhaps they would test it on animals, because certainly there wasn't the same respect for animals that we have today.
This is a very trivial question. Victoria, are you a fan of Terry Pratchett?
Yes, I do like Terry Pratchett.
Just that.
Aha. But anything included? Or is that going to be the next chapter?
Oh no, I didn't think that. But one of his set of characters is based on the Three Witches in
Of course. Yeah. That's true. Any further questions? Oh.
You've talked about belladonna, and I suppose you know that it's got its name because it affects the eyes and make women more charming. And it's used, as far as I know, it's still used.
Yeah. I mean, I think as well it was used in poisoning in Italy. They made something called acqua tofana, which I think was used to poison unpleasant husbands or something similar to that. These women just buying a pot of perfume.
That's it. Recipes are available.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Good.
Have you got any examples of ethnopharmacology in places like the tribes in Brazil or?
So the expert on here, Michael Heinrich, specialises in Mexican ethnopharmacology. So he does a lot of work with, I think he works specifically with Guatemalan tribes, looking at how they use plants and their sort of combination of spiritual beliefs and medicine. So I think he's worked quite extensively on that.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah. I think we'll put the video up on the website and our YouTube channel. We'll also put a link to, obviously, for those that aren't members of the Royal Society of Chemistry or have access to Chemistry World, we'll put a link to the full article. But, sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt. We've seen the resurgence of like Wicca or practices on social media recently. Is there anything that is helpful on there, as in the sense of that they try things as if the witches back in the days, and anything coming from that, or is it just a replication of what's already been done?
So I don't know whether there's anything new coming from that, in the sense that I think the people taking part in that sort of practice aren't taking part in it from a research perspective. They're using existing knowledge. I think it is important to bear in mind that using these traditional remedies alongside conventional medicine can sometimes have risks. So frequently St. John's wort has warning labels for certain prescription medications in the same way that grapefruit does. So it is important to bear that in mind. But there's every reason to suppose that these herbal practices do have efficacy. So if people choose to use those and get some benefit from it, then certainly if that works for them.
Any final questions?
Presumably the Chinese have developed a lot of this kind of stuff, because they seem to be very much into medicines that are not based on pharmaceutical products but on extracts from various.
I would imagine so. I think it's a component of Chinese shamanism as well, but I don't know so much about that.
Yeah, so there's an awful lot of traditional medicine outlets in China, that's for sure.
So apparently in Mexico they tend to use magic mushrooms, where in Europe we used alkaloids. So pick your hallucinogenic.
Yeah, okay.
But the spotted mushroom, I'm not sure what it's called, but the one that's red with white spots on. Apparently that was used in Eastern Europe quite a lot to achieve the same thing. Essentially, anywhere in the world, people have always found something hallucinogenic for their magic.
That's it. Well, we've not always had TV or the internet, have we? So I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Any final question before we? Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you for having
me.
And this is not dose dependent.
Well, unless you're diabetic, a wee present.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.